Not just that, your phone, your wristwatch, even the glowing numbers on your dashboard all stop at the same time. You glance into the rearview mirror, and see a shadow that shouldn't be there, shifting in the back seat, waiting. This wasn't a dream. This wasn't exhaustion. For Detective Rowe, it was the moment he realized the doorway wasn't a metaphor. It was real. And it was opening. Backhand index pointing right before I tell you what Rose saw when time finally broke, make sure you're following / subscribed, because these are the kinds of stories I'll always bring you, strange, dark, and mysterious. The story continues. Rowe gripped the steering wheel until his knuckles turned white. His car was silent, unnervingly so. Even the hum of the engine seemed muted, distant, like he was trapped underwater. The shadow in his rear view didn't move like a person. It pulsed. It stretched. It seemed to bleed into the edges of the glass. He didn't dare turn around. His dashboard clock still read 11:40 p.m. Time was holding its breath. And then, the second hand twitched. 11:41. Rowe's vision blurred. The world outside the windshield melted away. He wasn't on the road anymore. The other side. He found himself standing in a vast, black expanse. No ground, no sky. Just an endless void. In front of him, hundreds, maybe thousands, of frozen clocks floated in the darkness. Some were ornate, some were digital, some were broken, but all were frozen at the same exact time, 11:41. And behind those clocks, something stirred. A figure, impossibly tall, made of writhing shadows. It had no face, but its presence pressed against Rowe's chest like a crushing weight. A voice, not heard, but felt, filled the void. The doorway is open. The revelation. Rowe stumbled backward, clutching his head. In flashes, he saw Latham scribbling frantically in his basement, whispering the same phrase again and again. He saw the officers frozen, their eyes wide with terror. He saw Mrs. Tollin's trembling hands as her clock froze. And he understood. Latham hadn't discovered the doorway. He had accidentally opened it. His calculations, his experiments, whatever he was trying to prove, had created a fracture in reality. A tear in the fabric of time itself. And at exactly 11:41 p.m., every night since, the tear widened. The final moment. The shadow figure leaned closer. The clocks behind it began ticking again, all at once, but instead of moving forward, they moved backward. Faster and faster, reversing time. Rowe screamed, his voice swallowed by the void. Then, silence. He woke up in his car, gasping. His hands still clutched the wheel. The road stretched out in front of him, normal, empty. His dashboard clock now read 11:42 p.m. For a brief, foolish moment, he thought it was over. But when he checked his phone, the screen was cracked. Across the display, burned into the glass itself, was a message he hadn't typed. See you tomorrow. 11:41. The aftermath. Rowe never returned to duty. He vanished a month later, his car found abandoned at the edge of town. The clock on the dashboard was frozen at, you guessed it, 11:41 p.m. To this day, locals swear their clocks sometimes stutter at night, skipping a second when the world seems to hold its breath. They whisper about the shadows, about the hum in the walls, about the moment when time dies. And every so often, someone reports seeing Rowe himself, standing in the dark, frozen, like he's waiting for the doorway to open again. So the next time you notice your clock glitch, or your phone freeze at a strange time, don't ignore it. Don't brush it off. Because it might not be your device malfunctioning. It might be the doorway. And it always opens at 11:41. Imagine walking into a house where time itself had stopped. Not metaphorically, literally. Every single clock, wristwatch, and digital timer inside frozen at the exact same moment. Now, At first glance, you might think this is some eerie coincidence, maybe a power surge, maybe a prank. But what if I told you that the exact second all those clocks stopped was the exact second someone inside that house was murdered? And here's the part that will stay with you. When investigators finally pieced together what had happened, they realized the killer hadn't just taken a life, they had bent time itself to cover their tracks. If stories like this, dark, chilling mysteries that blur the line between reality and the unexplainable, keep you up at night, then you're in the right place. Make sure you hit follow, because I bring you stories like this always. Story begins. On a cold January night in 1987, the small town of Millstone, Pennsylvania was quiet, too quiet. Millstone was one of those tucked-away American towns where the air smelled like firewood in winter, where everyone knew each other's names, and where nothing truly bad was ever supposed to happen. But that night, in a small two-story brick house at the end of Brookwell Lane, something so disturbing took place that even seasoned detectives would later admit it haunted them for years. The house belonged to Eleanor Price, a 42-year-old widow who had lived there most of her life. To her neighbors, Eleanor was soft-spoken, polite, and just a little old-fashioned. She kept her curtains drawn most of the time, and her yard was always neat, though no one could remember the last time she actually had visitors. That night, though, Eleanor's neighbors noticed something odd. At exactly 11:34 p.m., all the lights in her house suddenly flicked off, then on again. Just once. Just a flicker. The kind of thing you'd shrug off as a power surge. Except here's where it gets strange. Minutes later, a piercing scream ripped through Brookwell Lane. Several neighbors later described it as blood-curdling and not human-sounding. But just as fast as it started, it stopped. The silence afterward was so heavy that people hesitated to even call the police, almost like they were afraid to disturb whatever had just happened inside that house. When police finally arrived, what they found inside the Price home would confuse, terrify, and mystify them in equal measure. The scene. The living room looked wrong. Not messy, not chaotic, but wrong. Every clock, wall clocks, alarm clocks, even the digital one on the microwave, had frozen at 11:34 p.m. Not blinking 12 o'clock like after a power outage. Not dead. Just frozen, as if time itself had stopped ticking at that moment. But it wasn't just the clocks. Eleanor's wristwatch, lying on the coffee table, also read 11:34. A VCR cord played them. The hands of an antique grandfather clock, which Eleanor kept in the hallway, were locked in place. And in the center of that frozen world, lying lifeless on the carpet, was Eleanor Price. She had been strangled. Her face bore the unmistakable signs, red markings around her neck, eyes bulging slightly, lips tinged blue. But there was something more disturbing. Beside her body lay a small, shattered timepiece. A pocket watch, old, gold, and cracked. It wasn't Eleanor's. First theories. The first responding officers immediately suspected a break-in gone wrong. But there was no sign of forced entry. The doors were locked, windows intact. Nothing of value appeared to be missing. The stopped clocks were explained away, at least initially, as some freak electrical surge. But the coroner's early notes raised eyebrows. Eleanor's time of death was estimated to be exactly 11:34 p.m. The same minute the clocks had frozen. Coincidence? Maybe. But if it wasn't, what did it mean? Detective Harold Finch, a grizzled veteran of the Millstone PD, was assigned to the case. Finch wasn't a man easily rattled. He'd seen stabbings, shootings, domestic disputes turn deadly. But this was different. He later told a reporter. It wasn't just a crime scene. It felt like stepping into a photograph. Like the house itself was trapped in the moment she died. The witness. The first potential clue came from across the street. A teenage boy named Tommy Rourke, who'd been sneaking a cigarette on his roof that night, claimed he'd seen something just before the lights flickered in Eleanor's house. He swore he saw a man in a dark coat and hat standing perfectly still under the street lamp across from Eleanor's front yard. The man didn't move, didn't smoke, didn't shift his weight. Just stood there. And then, seconds before the scream, he was gone. Not walked away. Not run. Just gone. Police chalked it up to teenage imagination. But Tommy stuck to his story for decades. Eleanor's secrets. As detectives dug deeper into Eleanor's past, a troubling picture began to emerge. Though she had seemed quiet and ordinary, Eleanor had been keeping a journal. And in that journal, she wrote extensively about the man who visits when the clocks stop. At first, detectives assumed this was some kind of metaphor, maybe Eleanor's way of coping with her loneliness after her husband's death. But the entries grew darker, more frantic. Last night, he stood at the foot of my bed. The ticking stopped. I couldn't breathe. He says he will come for me at 11:34. Always 11:34. I think time belongs to him. These writings sent a chill through the investigative team. The case widens. Word spread quickly in Millstone, and within days, locals began reporting strange happenings of their own. One woman claimed that at exactly 11:34 p.m. the night of Eleanor's death, her entire kitchen full of appliances had reset, even though there was no outage in her neighborhood. Another man insisted his watch stopped at 11:34, and no matter how many times he replaced the battery, it would not start again. By the end of that week, half the town was convinced that Eleanor hadn't been murdered by a person at all, but by something else. But then, just when the case seemed destined to vanish into folklore, Detective Finch made a discovery that would change everything. Buried beneath Eleanor's floorboards, hidden in a small wooden box, was a stack of letters. Old, yellowed, some going back as far as 1949. All of them written in the same tight, hurried handwriting. The timekeeper's letters. Think about the scariest letter you've ever received. A bill you couldn't pay. A breakup note. A medical result. Now imagine a letter that wasn't about money, love, or health, but about time itself. Imagine pulling it from an old wooden box, and the first line reads, "When the clocks stop, he is already inside the house." That's exactly what Detective Harold Finch found buried under Eleanor Price's floorboards, letters signed by someone who called themselves the timekeeper. The investigation deepens. Detective Finch spread the letters across the evidence table under the harsh fluorescent lights of the Millstone Police Department. Some were decades old, others recent. The oldest dated back to 1949, long before Eleanor Price was even born. The content was alarming. These weren't love letters or friendly exchanges. They read more like warnings, or threats. One letter, written in 1962, said, "To whomever receives this, know that the moment you hear silence, the moment ticking stops, you have already lost." He waits in the stillness. He waits at 11:34. Another, dated 1974. "I watched him enter a boy's room. The parents never knew. He froze their clocks, but I was too afraid to stop him. I think he collects something. Not just lives, something else." And the most recent, possibly just weeks before Eleanor's death. "He comes to me in dreams now. He says time is not mine, not ours. When my clock stops, he will be here for me." Finch's gut twisted. Were these delusions? Elaborate pranks? Or did Eleanor truly believe someone, or something, was stalking her through time? The one detail that froze Detective Finch's blood was this: every letter ended with the same sign-off. "Sincerely, the timekeeper." No initials, no address. Just that name. Finch knew Eleanor lived alone. If she had been writing these letters herself, why sign them with someone else's name? If she had received them, why hadn't she told anyone? Unless, she wasn't just writing them. Maybe she was answering them. Theories began. The department split into camps. Some believed Eleanor had been corresponding with a real person, maybe even her killer, who had used this timekeeper persona to manipulate and terrify her. Others thought Eleanor had written the letters herself, the work of a disturbed mind spiraling into paranoia. But Finch couldn't ignore one haunting fact: the letters spanned decades. If Eleanor had written them all, she would have started as a child. Impossible. Which left one terrifying possibility: The timekeeper had been around for generations. The coroner's revelation. As detectives wrestled with the letters, the coroner delivered new findings. Eleanor's time of death had been further narrowed down, 11:34 and 16 seconds p.m. 16 seconds past the minute. And here's the disturbing part. When police collected Eleanor's clocks, they found that every single one had stopped at a different second, but all within the span of those same 16 seconds. It wasn't just the minute that froze. It was a chain reaction, each clock dying one by one within those crucial seconds. Almost like something had moved through the house, killing time as it went. Eleanor's past. Finch decided to trace Eleanor's history, looking for anything unusual. He discovered that Eleanor's late husband, Richard Price, had died in 1978 under strange circumstances. The official cause of death? A heart attack at the dinner table. But the medical examiner's notes included a bizarre detail. Richard had been wearing a wristwatch that stopped ticking at the exact moment he died. At the time, no one thought much of it. Watches break. But now, with Eleanor strangled at 11:34 and every clock in her house frozen, Finch wondered, had the timekeeper been haunting Eleanor's family all along? The archivist. At this point, Finch brought in outside help, an old friend named Dr. Charles Emmett, a retired history professor with a fascination for folklore. Emmett sat down with the letters and immediately noticed something the detectives had missed: the handwriting style. The penmanship in the earliest letters from the 1940s was eerily similar to the most recent ones in the 1980s. This isn't just someone writing in the same style, Emmett said quietly. This is the same hand. Decades apart. Unchanged. Which made no sense. People's handwriting evolves with age. Pressure, slant, shape, it all changes. But here it was frozen, as if the writer had never aged a day. Emmett leaned back in his chair and whispered, "If these letters are real, then whoever wrote them hasn't just been around for decades. He hasn't changed in decades." The stranger in town. A week after Eleanor's funeral, reports came in of a stranger seen wandering Millstone late at night. Descriptions varied, but common details emerged: a tall man in a long black coat, wearing a wide-brimmed hat. One woman swore she saw him standing outside the old clock shop downtown, staring into the window display long after midnight. Another claimed he had appeared at the end of her driveway, motionless, only to vanish when she looked back. When shown a sketch artist's rendering, Tommy Rourke, the boy who had seen someone outside Eleanor's house, immediately confirmed, "That's him. That's the man I saw." The town began whispering. Parents told children to stay inside after dark. Old-timers muttered about curses. And more than one person began setting extra clocks in their home, convinced that if they kept time moving, they could keep the timekeeper away. The pocket watch. Remember the shattered pocket watch found beside Eleanor's body? It was sent to the state crime lab for analysis. What they discovered was unnerving. The watch wasn't just broken, it had been struck from the inside. Tiny stress fractures on the inner glass suggested pressure pushing outward, as though something inside the watch had tried to break free. And the time on the watch? 11 hours and 34 minutes sharp. The folklore connection. Dr. Emmett dug deeper into archives and found references to an old Pennsylvania folktale dating back to the late 1800s. Farmers told stories of a figure called the timekeeper, described as a shadowy man who wandered towns at night, collecting the moments people lost, missed opportunities, wasted hours, stolen time. Legend said he carried a golden watch, and when it struck your hour, your clocks would stop, your breath would freeze, and your life would end at the time he chose. Most dismissed it as superstition. But now, with Eleanor dead, the folklore felt more like a warning. The second death. Just as Millstone was beginning to calm down, it happened again. 2 weeks after Eleanor's murder, another resident, Paul Henson, a 29-year-old mechanic, was found dead in his apartment. Cause of death: suffocation. No signs of forced entry. No fingerprints. And once again, every clock in his home was frozen at 11:34. But there was one difference this time. Beside his body, scratched into the wall with something sharp, were the words, "Your time was mine." The town unravels. Panic gripped Millstone. People stopped going out at night. Stores closed early. Churches filled with people praying for protection. Detective Finch barely slept. The letters, the clocks, the stranger, it all pointed to something beyond human explanation. But Finch wasn't ready to believe in folklore. Not yet. He still clung to the idea that the timekeeper was flesh and blood, a killer hiding behind a myth. What he didn't know yet was that the timekeeper was already watching him. Every detective has one case that keeps them awake at night. For Detective Harold Finch, it wasn't just the brutality of Eleanor Price's death, or even the strange letters signed by the timekeeper. It was the night he woke up in his own home at exactly 11:34 p.m., looked over at his alarm clock, and saw it had stopped. If you're the kind of person who believes that stories of folklore and urban legends stay in the past, wait until you hear how the timekeeper didn't just stalk Millstone, he followed the detective himself. Make sure you're following along, because what happens next will make you rethink every second you've ever wasted. Finch's awakening. It was 3 nights after Paul Henson's death when Finch bolted upright in bed. He didn't know why he woke, but the silence was suffocating. No hum of the refrigerator. No distant traffic. No ticking from the old mantel clock his father had given him. He turned to his nightstand. His alarm clock's red digital numbers glared back, 11:34. Frozen. Finch's heart raced. He fumbled for his wristwatch, same thing. The second hand stuck between ticks. And then he noticed something else. A faint sound from the hallway. Not footsteps. Not breathing. But the slow, deliberate click of a pocket watch opening and closing. By the time Finch grabbed his service revolver and stormed into the hall, the sound had stopped. And the clocks had started ticking again. The strain on the detective. The next morning, Finch looked pale, shaken. He told no one what had happened. In the world of police work, credibility was everything, and he couldn't risk being branded as unstable. But from that moment on, his obsession deepened. He reread Eleanor's journals late into the night. He studied the letters, searching for patterns. He even started recording his own clocks, leaving cassette tapes running, trying to catch the moment they stopped. His colleagues noticed. One officer muttered, "He's not investigating the case anymore. He's living it." And maybe that was true. The connection between victims. Finch's breakthrough came when he began cross-referencing Eleanor Price and Paul Henson's lives. On the surface, they had nothing in common. Eleanor, a quiet widow in her 40s. Paul, a young mechanic, single, outgoing. But then Finch found it. Both had lived, at different times, in the same apartment building on Ashwood Street. Eleanor had lived there briefly in the early 70s, before marrying Richard Price. Paul had moved in nearly a decade later. The building itself was unremarkable, except for one detail. In the basement, tucked into a forgotten corner, was an old, rusting grandfather clock. The landlord told Finch it had been there for decades. No one knew who had left it. No one touched it, because no matter what they did, the clock always reset itself to the same time, 11:34. The town historian. Finch returned to Dr. Emmett, the folklore professor, with this new lead. Emmett's face turned pale when he heard about the basement clock. "There's an old superstition," he said carefully, "that certain objects can anchor things. Spirits. Forces. They call them tether clocks. Wherever that clock goes, so does he." Finch scoffed at first. "You're telling me a damn antique clock is killing people?" Emmett shook his head. "Not killing. Calling. Eleanor's husband's past." Then came another revelation. Digging through old records, Finch discovered that Eleanor's late husband, Richard Price, had once been part owner of that very Ashwood Street apartment building. In fact, it was Richard who had moved Eleanor into the unit all those years ago. So when Richard died of a sudden heart attack in 1978, his watch freezing at 11:34, was it really coincidence? Or had the timekeeper already marked their family decades earlier? The stranger returns. Reports of the man in the black coat increased. This time, witnesses claimed he wasn't just standing outside homes. He was closer, watching through windows, standing at the edge of hallways, always gone the moment anyone looked directly at him. And there was a detail no one had mentioned before. Those who glimpsed him swore he carried a chain dangling from his coat pocket. At the end of the chain, a golden watch. The break-in. One night, Finch received a frantic call from Mrs. Lydia Henson, Paul's mother. She swore someone had broken into her home. Nothing was stolen, but every clock in her house had stopped at 11:34, even though it was only 10:50 when she called. Finch rushed over. He searched the home top to bottom. No footprints. No broken locks. No sign of forced entry. But in the kitchen, on the wall above the stove, he found something chilling. Carved into the wallpaper with something sharp were 3 words. "You are late." Finch's desperation. The case was spiraling, and Finch knew it. He couldn't protect the town. He couldn't explain the phenomenon. And now the timekeepers seemed to be targeting not just victims, but those investigating. Finch made a drastic decision. He took the shattered pocket watch found at Eleanor's crime scene and kept it in his desk at home. He wanted to study it himself, convinced it was the key. That night, as he sat staring at it under the lamplight, the cracked glass reflected his face back at him. But for a split second, he swore he didn't see his own reflection. He saw a tall figure in a black coat, standing behind him. When he spun around, the room was empty. But the watch had ticked once. The pattern emerges. Finch finally began piecing together the timeline. Eleanor's husband Richard, dead at 11:34 in 1978. Eleanor herself, strangled at 11:34 in 1987. Paul Henson, suffocated at 11:34 weeks later. The span between the deaths varied, but the constant was the time. 11:34. And then Finch realized something else. When flipped upside down, 11:34 on a digital clock spells hell. Was this coincidence? Or had the town been staring at the answer the whole time? The chilling call. Then came the night Finch received the most unsettling phone call of his life. He was at the station, poring over files, when the desk phone rang. The line was full of static. Then a slow, measured voice whispered, "Detective. Your time is mine." Finch froze. "Who is this?" The voice answered only with the sound of a pocket watch ticking. And then the line went dead. Finch glanced at the wall clock in the station. It read, 11:34. The third death. The following morning, news broke of a third victim. Maggie Klein, a 17-year-old high school senior, was found dead in her bed by her parents. Cause of death, asphyxiation. No signs of a struggle. And yes, every clock in the Klein household had stopped at 11:34. But this scene had one more clue. On Maggie's nightstand was a folded piece of paper. On it, in the same handwriting as the old letters, were 5 words. He cannot be stopped. Millstone was breaking apart. Parents refused to let their children sleep alone. Churches were overflowing. Newspapers refused to print the phrase "the timekeeper," afraid of feeding hysteria. And Finch? He looked like a man possessed. His colleagues whispered about his sunken eyes, his trembling hands. One officer swore he saw Finch flinch at the sound of his own watch ticking. But Finch wasn't losing his mind. He was realizing the truth. The timekeeper wasn't just hunting victims. He was hunting him. The frozen second. It's one thing for a single clock to stop during a power outage. It's another for every clock in a house, battery-powered, digital, mechanical, even antique, to all freeze at the exact same second. But what truly disturbed investigators wasn't just that every timepiece stopped at 11:41 p.m. It was that when they restarted them, the clocks refused to move past that time. No matter how many times they were reset, they always stopped again. Backhand index pointing right before I take you further into this strange, dark, and mysterious case, hit that follow/subscribe button now. Because you'll always get the next story. The story continues. Detective Rowe was standing in John Latham's living room, surrounded by clocks that had become silent tombstones to a single moment in time. The forensic team had already photographed them, bagged evidence, and checked power sources. But Rowe lingered, staring at the unmoving hands of a delicate silver pocket watch lying on the mantel. Its face, too, read 11:41. He flicked the winding mechanism, listening for the reassuring tick. Nothing. It was like the gears themselves had turned to stone. And here's where things got even stranger. A technician tried replacing the batteries in the wall clocks, but instead of springing back to life, the second hand just twitched, then froze again at the exact same mark. It was as if time itself was refusing to move forward inside that house. Witness accounts. Word leaked fast. Neighbors began whispering. One young man down the street swore that his phone glitched at 11:41 the night of the murder, screen freezing, calls dropping. An older woman claimed her grandfather clock skipped a beat at the same moment, even though she lived 2 blocks away. Were they exaggerating? Maybe. But the fear in their voices told Rowe otherwise. A lead in the basement. The real breakthrough came when officers searched Latham's basement. It wasn't a typical basement full of boxes and tools. Instead, they found rows of meticulously stacked notebooks, each filled with complex calculations, bizarre geometric drawings, and repeated phrases scrawled in the margins. One phrase appeared dozens of times. 11:41 is when the door opens. Rowe flipped through the notebooks in disbelief. Was Latham obsessed with time? Or had he been trying to warn someone? The first disturbance. While cataloging the basement, something unexplainable happened. 2 officers working near the shelves suddenly stopped mid-motion, their flashlights still raised. For 10 full seconds, they stood frozen like mannequins. When they snapped out of it, both gasped, eyes wide, claiming they had been pulled into a black space where the only sound was the ticking of a clock. The chilling part? Both officers described hearing the same thing, a clock ticking backwards. Rowe felt the weight of dread settle over him. This wasn't just a homicide anymore. Something had bled into the moment of John Latham's death, something that bent reality itself. And the deeper he went into those notebooks, the clearer it became. Latham hadn't been afraid of dying. He had been afraid of 11:41. The moment time died. Emotional hook. Imagine standing in a room where every single clock, grandfather clocks, wristwatches, wall clocks, even the tiny digital timer on a microwave, has frozen. Not ticking, not beeping, not even humming. Silent. Dead. And the exact moment every clock stopped? It's the exact minute a man was brutally murdered in that very house. Now here's the part that will chill you. Experts, engineers, even horologists, the people who dedicate their entire lives to the study of time, cannot explain how every clock, powered by different sources, all failed at once. This wasn't just a killing. This was the murder of time itself. Backhand index pointing right. Before I take you further into this mystery, hit that follow/subscribe button right now. Because these are the kinds of stories I tell, strange, dark, and mysterious, and I promise, you'll always get the next one. The story continues. Detective Rowe stood in the victim's living room, his notepad limp in his hand. The stillness was maddening. Even the air in the house seemed heavy, as if it too had stopped moving. The clocks weren't just stopped, they were accusing. Their frozen faces pointed, silently, to 11:41 p.m., the precise moment John Latham was found dead. Rowe had been on hundreds of crime scenes. He'd seen every variety of human depravity. But this was something else. He walked over to a heavy, ornate grandfather clock in the corner. Its pendulum was stuck mid-swing, as though gravity itself had decided to take a break. He touched the casing. It was warm, faintly humming, as if it had been fighting to keep going until that exact instant. Power surge, an officer suggested, but Rowe knew better. The wall clock ran on AA batteries. The microwave's digital display was hardwired. A wristwatch in the victim's drawer, battery-powered, also read 11:41. Different systems. Same death. The investigation deepens. Word spread fast. Soon, journalists camped outside the house, whispering about a curse, about supernatural interference. Locals avoided the street entirely. Meanwhile, Roe called in specialists. An electrical engineer tore through the home's wiring, nothing abnormal. A watchmaker examined the wristwatch, no defects. Even a physicist from the nearby university got involved, but all she could say was, "Whatever happened here, it wasn't natural." But then came the detail that pushed this case into true nightmare territory. The neighbor's story. Across the street, an elderly woman named Mrs. Tolland came forward. She claimed that on the night of the murder, she was woken by a low, vibrating hum. Not from inside her house, but everywhere, like the world itself was trembling. When she glanced out her window at 11:40 p.m., she saw something she would later describe as shadows that didn't belong to anything. They flickered along the victim's walls, even though there were no cars, no people, no light sources outside. And then, as the shadows slid across the window, her own kitchen clock froze. She showed Roe. The battery was brand new. Time had stopped for her too. The pattern. Over the next week, reports trickled in. Clocks in houses near the murder scene had also stopped at exactly 11:41 p.m. Not all of them, just a few. Enough to form a chilling radius. Roe pinned a map on the precinct wall, placing red tacks at each home where time had frozen. The shape it formed wasn't random, it was almost circular, with John Latham's house at the dead center. It was as if the murder had sent out a shockwave, rippling through reality itself, freezing time in its path. A breakthrough? Roe's team dug deeper into Latham's life. On the surface, he was a retired math teacher, widowed, living quietly. But hidden in his basement, they discovered something deeply unsettling. Dozens of meticulously kept notebooks, filled with calculations. Not ordinary equations. These were cryptic, sprawling patterns of numbers, symbols, and strange geometric diagrams. One line, scribbled again and again, stood out. 11:41 is the doorway. Roe's pulse spiked. Latham knew something. And whatever he had uncovered, whether science, superstition, or something in between, had cost him his life. But before Roe could piece together the meaning of those numbers, before he could even finish the first notebook, something happened. Two officers, tasked with cataloging the basement, suddenly stopped moving. Just froze. For a full 10 seconds, their bodies rigid, eyes wide open. And when they came to, both claimed they had been standing in a pitch-black void, where the only sound was the relentless ticking of a clock. Except the ticking wasn't in rhythm. It was counting down. And whatever it was counting toward, it hadn't run out yet. The doorway at 11:41. Picture this, two trained police officers in the middle of an investigation suddenly freeze like statues. Their eyes open, their bodies stiff, but their minds somewhere else entirely. When they snap back seconds later, both describe being trapped in the exact same vision, a black void, the sound of a broken clock ticking unevenly, and a terrifying sense that something was waiting for them in the dark. Now here's the nightmare part, when those officers compared their experiences, they realized they weren't just imagining the same vision. They were describing the exact same countdown, a countdown that seemed to be leading back to 11:41 p.m. Backhand index pointing right if you're still here, locked in with me, hit follow/subscribe now, because these stories, strange, dark, and mysterious, are the ones I'll always bring you. The story continues. Detective Rose sat at his desk long after the officers had gone home. The precinct was nearly empty, the hum of the vending machine the only sound. He couldn't shake the image of their pale faces, their voices trembling as they recounted the void. He opened Latham's notebook again, his eyes tracing the repeated phrase. 11:41 is the doorway. Was this what Latham had discovered? A doorway, but to where? And why had he written it like a warning, scribbled in frantic handwriting dozens of times across hundreds of pages? Roe leaned back in his chair, staring at the precinct clock on the wall. It read 11:12 p.m. He couldn't help but feel as though time itself was stalking him, inching closer to that cursed number. The call that changed everything. Just as his exhaustion began to take hold, Roe's phone rang. It was Mrs. Tolland, the elderly neighbor who had seen the shadows that didn't belong. Her voice was shaky. "Detective, it's happening again. The hum. It's outside my window right now." Roe was out the door before she finished the sentence. When he arrived at her home, she was trembling on her porch, clutching a small silver cross. Inside, her kitchen clock had once again frozen, this time at 11:39 p.m., 2 minutes before the murder time. The hum she described was still faintly vibrating through the walls, a low, bone-deep frequency Roe could feel in his chest. And then, he saw them. The shadows returned. Along the siding of her house, stretching unnaturally, were dark, fluid shapes. They slithered as though alive, flickering in and out like static. They didn't match any tree, pole, or object in the environment. They weren't cast by light. They were simply